into this opening. But basically, the entire mass is missing. It's reminiscent to me of when I lost my right kidney. The surgeon took the kidney out and left an open space, which, of course, my other organs filled in. But here we have this open space. It's as though surgery had been performed on Building 6. Here's Building 5 with these cookie-cutter cutouts. And as I've already observed, there were as many as 50. Once again, it's very difficult to imagine how these effects could have been brought about by, for example, falling debris from the north and south tower. Very odd indeed. Here's Building 4. Half of it's there. Half of it, which should be in the immediate foreground, is completely gone. Completely gone. Completely gone. Here's Building 3, the Marriott Hotel. It's as though some enormous Paul Bunyan took a giant axe and gave it a huge whack. Very odd here. Very difficult to imagine what could have brought about that destruction. In addition, we have hundreds of what Judy has referred to as toasted cars. Some of them are really quite bizarre. For example, there are police cars where the back end of the car is as though it were new, the gas tank is unexploded, and yet the engine compartment is completely destroyed. So it appears as though we may be dealing with some source of energy that has an affinity for heavy iron or steel objects. Notice how some of these cars are wilted like a wet rag. We have had similar reports from Iraq, where some sophisticated energy weapons have been used to take, for example, a Volkswagen full of human beings and reduce it to ash, and they are cremated as though they had been at Hiroshima during the nuclear blast. We also have some beams that are in a hangar at JFK that show considerable distortion, but precisely what brought it about is not at all obvious. Now, it's fascinating to observe, and this appears to have been very important in relation to the mode of destruction of the building, that the north and south tower were built in what is referred to as the bathtub. It was a kind of dike built around their foundation to keep the Hudson River water out. If the bathtub had shattered, then the Hudson River water would have flooded ground zero into the subway tunnels and the path train tunnels that go beneath the Hudson to New Jersey and weakened the foundation of the major structures in lower Manhattan. It would have been quite a catastrophe. In fact, this is excavation after the attacks, and the bathtubs remain basically intact. Here's a view from the North Tower. Now, just to offer you an illustration of how sensitive it was when they were cleaning things up. When they took down Building 6, which was only an 8-story building, they used a crane and sort of tugged it down gently because they didn't want to damage the bathtub. Think about it. An 8-story residue of a wall. They sort of tugged down because they didn't want to damage the bathtub. Well, imagine what had happened if one or another of these 500,000-ton buildings had collapsed into the bathtub. You would have had a catastrophe. And in fact, even photos of the subway show that they're not only not full of Hudson River water, but they're also not full of molten metal. Now, one of the most interesting observations is that a lot of water was poured onto the World Trade Center. In fact, some 11 million gallons of water. Here you see part of the cleanup, which may have involved the use of thermite, to take apart some remaining steel structures. Here's the result of a steam explosion that occurred in New York City, where the driver of this truck was sustained like third-degree burns over 80% of his body. Steam explosions are very nasty. And if there had been massive pools of molten metal, then even though the Hudson River didn't pour onto it, that 11 million gallons of water would have been more than sufficient to bring them about. It's interesting that here we see some kind of misting. It looks like it could be steam, but it evidently isn't because the workers are not reacting to it as though it were. There's also some process going on by which the remaining steel is being turned into rust very rapidly. Something very unusual is taking place here. Once again, you can see the massiveness of the devastation to the ground zero at the World Trade Center. Now, Rudy Giuliani boasted greatly about how efficient it was in getting hundreds of trucks in to clean up the debris. But what he didn't mention is that those trucks were bringing in tons and tons of dirt. Now, this is rather reminiscent of Chernobyl. Notice all this massive dirt here. And Judy has recorded a sequence during which the debris piles are actually growing, not reducing in size, but actually growing because of the addition of massive tonnages of dirt. Now, at Chernobyl, in order to cope with the effects of radioactivity, massive tons of dirt were brought in to absorb the residual effects that had brought it about. And something similar appears to be going on here. Once again, we have a lot of dirt at the site. We have equipment working. We have this, notice how much the rust, this turning to rust, seemingly extremely rapidly, which has led Judy to speculate that some process of molecular dissociation, something that broke the bonds that bind atoms together into molecules, was at work here. Now, some of the arguments that have been given for conventional explosive plus thermite include this photograph of what seems to be molten metal coming out of the 80th floor, which, as I remind you, in the South Tower was the level at which the plane purportedly hit the building. Now, sometimes it's in the third groove, but other times it's in the fourth groove, so it seems to move around just a bit, but perhaps that's explainable. What I find difficult to understand, however, is that appears to be a unique phenomenon. If these buildings were loaded with thermite, then you would expect that flowing metal would occur at random around these buildings, and yet it is distinctive and appears to be unique to this location, suggesting that there must be something about that 80th floor that might be responsible here. And in fact, that floor was owned by the Fuji Bank, which had a massive array of batteries on this floor that were used as backup energy in case they lost the electrical power supply for their computers so they could preserve the records of their clients. And I believe what we're witnessing here is the flow of lead from the melted batteries, which has a much lower melting point, of course, than steel or aluminum. Here's another photograph that Judy has commented on. This is known as a grappler, and it's holding a piece of, glowing metal, which is at a very high temperature, probably in the vicinity of 2,000 degrees or more. What's interesting here is that the grappler operates on the basis of hydraulics. And when you study the relationship between temperature and hydraulics, they would cease to function at around 350 degrees. So if that were a bona fide photograph, then the grappler ought not to be functioning because of the intense heat that would be distributed. Remember, it's made out of steel. Steel is a good conductor, so it couldn't be lifting a piece of steel that was glowing at such a temperature without being affected itself. This may be my favorite photograph from the World Trade Center because it shows a group of workers peering into a cavern that is presumed to be molten metal. Stephen Jones had this photograph, for example, in support of his hypothesis of molten metal for months, maybe years, before I challenged him at Chandler and pointed out that we would not be expected to put our face over the spout of a tea kettle when it begins to whistle. And the temperature there is only 212 degrees. If this is glowing metal, then its temperature is closer to 3,000. And if we were in this vicinity, and that were indeed an opening into a cavern of molten metal, then the flesh would be melting from our arms and faces. This is clearly a fake photograph. Obviously, in scientific reasoning, you have to base your reasoning on all the available relevant evidence, but you have to sort out inauthentic evidence from authentic evidence. That has been the key to resolving the JFK assassination. And it would be the key here, too, if we could sort out the real from the fake. This is a fake photograph. In addition, Judy has pointed out that aerial thermal maps show that while the attack, of course, occurred on September 11th, and by the 16th, 5 days later, there were hot spots as early as the 23rd. This is now only about, 12 days later. There are, though, no longer all those glowing spots. So it looks as though the hypothesis of these massive pools of molten metal cannot be sustained when we sort out the authentic evidence from the inauthentic. This is also extremely interesting. The FAA grounded all aircraft shortly before World Trade Center 2 was destroyed and only allowed